The phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. I almost didn't answer it. At that age, when the phone rings that late, you already know it's never good news. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize. No name, no memory attached to it. I let it ring once, then twice, and something inside me told me, if you don't answer this, it will haunt you. So I picked up. There was silence on the other end, just breathing. Slow, shaky. Then a voice I hadn't heard in over 20 years said, "Please, come home. I have no one left." I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to understand how the woman who kicked me out at 18 was now begging me to come back. That word, home, the same home where she once stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and told me, "If you don't like it here, then leave." The same night she watched me walk out with a trash bag full of clothes and never called me again. For more than 2 decades, I built a life without her. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. So when she asked me to come home, I had one question echoing in my head. Why now? What happened inside that house after I left? What choices did she make? And what did they cost her? And the truth is, what I discovered when I finally went back was far more painful and far more revealing than I ever imagined. Before we go any further, I want to say this. If stories about family betrayal and karma speak to you, if you believe that the choices we make always come back around, then make sure you subscribe to No One Escapes Karma. That way, even if life pulls you away for a moment, you'll always be able to come back and find stories that remind you you're not alone. Now let me ask you something. If the person who hurt you the most was suddenly old alone and asking for help, would you go back? Because what happened next forced me to face a truth I had been avoiding my entire life. And I promise you this, the real karma in this story doesn't arrive the way anyone expects. Not for her, and not for me. I was 18 years old when my mother told me to leave. Not during some dramatic argument. Not after I did something illegal or unforgivable. It happened on an ordinary night. The kind of night you don't expect to remember for the rest of your life. I had just come home from work. A part-time job. Minimum wage. The kind of job you take because you're trying to be responsible, not because you have choices. Dinner was already over. The dishes were stacked in the sink. The television was on, but no one was really watching it. My mother was sitting at the table. Her husband stood near the counter. The air felt tight, like a room holding its breath. She asked me where I had been. I told her I had picked up an extra shift. She said I was always gone lately. I remember thinking, isn't that what you wanted? Then she said it. That sentence people say when they don't realize how sharp words can be. This isn't working anymore. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I just said I felt like I didn't belong there anymore. That's when her face changed. She crossed her arms and looked at me like I was a stranger who had overstayed their welcome. "If you don't like it here," she said, "then leave." I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because I didn't believe she meant it. Parents say things like that. They cool down. They apologize. I asked her if she was serious. She stood up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out a trash bag. She handed it to me. "Pack your things." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't a lesson. This wasn't discipline. This was a decision. I went to my room and started filling that bag. Clothes, a pair of shoes, a photo I kept hidden in a drawer. Everything else I left behind. When I came back to the living room, she didn't look at me. Her husband didn't say a word. No one tried to stop me. I stood by the door for a moment, just waiting. For something. A question. A second thought. An apology. Nothing came. So I opened the door and stepped outside. The night air felt colder than it should have. The porch light stayed on as the door closed behind me. I remember standing there with that trash bag in my hand, thinking, she'll open the door in a minute. She didn't. I waited 10 minutes, then 20. Finally, I walked down the driveway and didn't look back. I slept in my car that night. The next morning, I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages. I told myself she was just angry, that she'd calm down. Days passed, then weeks. Still nothing. When I tried calling, it went straight to voicemail. I realized something painful. She wasn't waiting for me to come back. She had already moved on. Years later, people would ask me why I left home so young. And I learned to answer with a half-truth. I wanted independence. The real answer was harder to say. I didn't leave because I wanted to grow up. I left because the one person who was supposed to protect me decided I was no longer worth keeping. And that night was only the beginning of everything that followed. The first few weeks after I left didn't feel real. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that my mother would call, that she just needed time to cool down. I checked my phone constantly. Every vibration made my heart jump. Nothing. I slept in my car at first, parked behind a grocery store where the lights stayed on all night. I told myself it was just for a few days. A few days turned into weeks. During the day I worked. At night, I tried to stay warm. I learned quickly which gas stations had bathrooms that stayed open, which diners didn't mind if you sat too long with one cup of coffee. I didn't tell anyone the truth. When coworkers asked where I lived, I said I was between places. When friends asked about my family, I said we weren't close. It was easier than explaining that my own mother had decided I was done being her responsibility. I still believed she would call. Every night before I fell asleep, I checked my phone one last time, and every morning the screen was empty. After about a month, I tried calling her again. This time, the voicemail message was different. She had changed it. That small detail hurt more than I expected. It meant she wasn't waiting for my call. She was moving forward, without me. I found a cheap room to rent from someone I barely knew. The mattress was thin. The walls were stained, but it had a lock on the door, and that felt like progress. I worked more hours, took whatever shifts I could get. I stopped thinking long-term. Survival became the goal. One afternoon, I ran into someone who knew my mother. They smiled politely and said, "I heard you moved out. Your mom said you wanted to be on your own." I didn't correct them. I just nodded. That was the first time I realized she had rewritten the story. I wasn't the kid she kicked out. I was the ungrateful child who chose to leave. That version of the story spread quickly. It protected her, and it erased me. There were nights when I almost called her again. Not to argue, not to demand anything, just to hear her voice. But something stopped me. A quiet voice inside said, if she wanted to know how you were, she would have asked. So I stayed silent. Months passed, then a year. The world didn't stop because my family fell apart. Bills still came. Life kept moving. I learned how to rely on myself, how to make decisions without asking anyone for permission. People call that growing up, but there was nothing empowering about it. It was lonely. Every holiday felt heavier. Every birthday passed quietly. And every time I saw a parent helping their child, something in my chest tightened. I wasn't angry at her. I was confused. I couldn't understand how a mother could go to sleep at night knowing her child didn't have a place to go. And yet, she did. That was when it finally sank in. I wasn't just surviving without a home. I was surviving without a family. And I had no idea then that the story she was telling about me would one day come back to her in ways she never expected. After a while, survival turned into routine. I stopped counting the days since I left. Not because they didn't matter, but because counting them hurt too much. Work became my anchor. If I stayed busy, I didn't have to think. I moved from job to job. Nothing glamorous, nothing anyone would brag about. But each paycheck meant I could breathe a little easier. Eventually, I found a steady position. Then another one that paid slightly better. I rented a small apartment, nothing special, but it was mine. The first night I slept there, the place felt painfully quiet. No voices through the walls, no doors slamming, just me. I sat on the floor, leaned against the wall, and realized something. I had built this without her. That thought didn't make me proud. It made me sad. I didn't call her to tell her I was doing okay. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I didn't know how. What do you say to someone who chose a life without you? I told myself she probably didn't care. That was easier than hoping she did. Years passed. I got older, more tired, more cautious. I learned how to keep people at a distance, not because I didn't want connection, but because I didn't trust it. I watched coworkers talk about family dinners, Sunday visits, and holidays. I smiled. I nodded. I never shared my story. It wasn't something people knew what to do with. Somewhere along the way, I built a life that looked normal from the outside. A job, responsibilities, routines. But there was a quiet rule I lived by. I didn't talk about my mother. Not to friends, not to partners, not even to myself. It was easier to act like she belonged to a different chapter, a closed one. I heard small pieces of news about her over the years, through mutual acquaintances, through people who didn't know the whole story. She's doing well. She's happy now. She finally has the family she wanted. Each sentence landed like a reminder. I wasn't part of that picture. There were moments I almost reached out. On her birthday, on holidays. But something always stopped me. Fear. Fear that she wouldn't answer. Fear that she would. By the time I turned 30, then 40, the distance between us felt permanent. I told myself I didn't need her, and in a practical sense, that was true. I paid my own bills, solved my own problems, but emotionally, there was a space that never filled. People assume time heals everything. It doesn't. Sometimes time just teaches you how to live with the wound. I avoided places that reminded me of my childhood. I avoided conversations that might bring her name up. I didn't want to open a door I wasn't sure I could close again. What I didn't know back then was that while I was building a life she never saw, she was building a version of herself that couldn't survive the truth forever. And one day, those two paths would cross again. Not because I planned it, but because karma has a way of finding its timing. For a long time, I believed my mother didn't think about me at all. That was the story I told myself. It made the distance easier to accept. But the truth was, she did think about me, just not in the way I imagined. I learned that years later by accident. I ran into an old neighbor one afternoon, someone who had known my family for years. They smiled warmly and said, "Your mom talks about you all the time." That sentence stopped me, because in all those years, she had never talked to me. The neighbor went on unaware of what they were opening. "She always says she tried her best," they said, "that you were difficult, that you wanted to leave." I stood there listening as my life was retold by someone else. In her version of the story, she was the patient mother, the one who sacrificed everything. And I was the rebellious child who walked away. It was a clean story, simple, comfortable. It left no room for guilt. As I heard more over time, the picture became clearer. She had created a perfect image of herself. To friends, to extended family, to the community. She talked about how hard it was to raise me, how much she worried, how she wished things had turned out differently. But there was always one detail missing. The night she told me to leave. That moment never made it into her story. Instead, she spoke of boundaries, of tough love, words that sounded reasonable. Until you knew the truth. I realized then that she hadn't erased me from her life. She had rewritten me. I wasn't the child she abandoned. I was the lesson she survived. And the more that image settled in her world, the harder it became for her to face reality. Because if she admitted what she had done, the perfect version of herself would fall apart. I heard about family gatherings I wasn't invited to, holidays where my absence was explained away. People believed her. Why wouldn't they? She looked composed, respectable, put together. No one questioned a mother who spoke calmly about a difficult child. For a moment, I felt anger rise. Not loud anger, quiet anger. The kind that sits in your chest and tightens your breathing. But then something else followed. Clarity. I understood why she never called, why she never tried to fix things. Reaching out to me would have meant admitting the lie, and she had been living inside it for too long. The irony was painful. While I was learning how to survive without a family, she was surrounded by people, yet still hiding. Her life looked full on the outside, but it was built on something fragile, a story that only worked as long as the truth stayed buried. I didn't know it then, but that perfect image was already starting to crack, and when it finally did, there would be no one left to help her hold it together. For years, my mother's life looked stable from the outside. At least, that's what people said. She had a house, a marriage, a routine, the kind of life that made others believe everything was fine. But stability built on denial doesn't last forever. The first crack came quietly. Her husband started coming home later, staying out longer, speaking less. At first she explained it away. Work stress, health issues, a phase. That was always her strength. Explaining things so she wouldn't have to face them. Then one day, he didn't come home at all. There was no dramatic fight, no shouting, just a suitcase missing from the closet. He left a note, short, careful. He said he needed space, that he felt like a guest in his own life. She told people she understood, but those close to her said she didn't sleep for days. The family she had chosen over me was already slipping through her fingers. The next loss came from the children she had poured everything into. They grew up. They moved on. They had their own lives, their own priorities. They stopped calling as often, stopped visiting. She said that was normal. That's just how kids are, she told people. But the house grew quieter. The phone rang less, and the silence she once used against me started pressing in on her. Then came the health problems. Nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue, doctor visits, medications she didn't want to talk about. She told people she was fine. She always said she was fine. But fine doesn't keep you company at night. Medical bills started to pile up. Her savings shrank faster than she expected. The house that once felt like proof of her success became a burden. Repairs she couldn't afford. Stares that hurt her knees. People noticed she stopped hosting gatherings. Stopped smiling as easily. The perfect image she had worked so hard to maintain required energy she no longer had. And one by one, the people who believed that image drifted away. Not because they were cruel, but because they had their own lives. That's when reality began to settle in. The life she built without me didn't have a backup plan. There was no one to catch her when things went wrong. She tried reaching out to relatives. They were polite, busy. She tried leaning on friends. They offered sympathy. From a distance, it wasn't their responsibility. It never was. Late one evening, she sat alone in that house. The same house where she once told me to leave. And for the first time in years, she couldn't avoid the question. Where was I? Not as a story, not as an excuse, but as a person. I wasn't there to help. I wasn't there to listen. I wasn't there to soften the loneliness, because she had made sure of that. Karma doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives as emptiness, as a quiet understanding that the choices you made worked exactly as intended, until they didn't. And in that silence, with nothing left to distract her, my mother finally realized something. She hadn't lost me all at once. She had been losing me every single day since the night she told me to walk out the door. And now, there was no one left to blame. By the time the phone rang that night, I hadn't thought about my mother in a long time. Not in any real way. She existed in the background of my life, like an old photograph you don't look at, but never throw away. It was 2:17 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I checked it twice. The first ring startled me. The second one made my stomach tighten. I almost let it go to voicemail. At that hour, bad news feels inevitable. When I answered, I didn't say anything. I waited. There was breathing on the other end. Slow, uneven. Then she spoke. She said my name, not the way she used to. Not sharp, not impatient. Soft. Tired. Please, she said. Come home. That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just those 2 words. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the phone, trying to decide how I felt. Anger would have been easier, but what I felt was something else. Distance, like the space between us, had grown so wide that even her voice couldn't cross it. I asked her what was wrong. She hesitated. Then she said, I don't have anyone else. That sentence landed heavier than anything she could have confessed, because it told me everything. She didn't call because she missed me. She called because she was alone. There was a pause. Then she added, I don't know how much time I have. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need details to understand. We sat there in silence, 2 people connected by blood, and nothing else. She told me she had been sick, that things were complicated, that she didn't want to worry anyone. I thought about all the years I had worried alone. I told her I would think about it. She said she understood, but her voice broke when she said goodbye. After the call ended, I didn't move. I stared at the wall, listening to the quiet hum of the house. I wasn't deciding whether to forgive her. That question came later. What I was deciding was simpler and harder. Whether I was willing to walk back into a place that had once rejected me. I slept badly that night. Memories surfaced without permission. The door closing behind me, the porch light, the silence. By morning, I still didn't have an answer. I went through my day on autopilot. Work, conversations that didn't register. Everything felt distant. That evening, I checked my phone again. She hadn't called. For the first time in years, the waiting was on her side. And I realized something uncomfortable. Going back wouldn't fix the past, but refusing to go back might lock me inside it forever. So I made a decision, not because she deserved it, but because I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. And whatever I found when I went back would change everything. I waited 3 days before I went back, not because I was trying to punish her. I just needed time to breathe. The drive felt longer than it used to, or maybe it only felt that way because every mile carried a memory. When I turned onto the old street, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. Nothing looked the way it did in my mind. The trees were taller, the houses smaller. Even the road felt narrower. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment. That was the same driveway where I had stood at 18 holding a trash bag, wondering if the door would open again. It never had. The house looked tired now. The paint was faded. The yard was overgrown. This place, that once felt permanent, now looked like it was barely holding itself together. I knocked. There was movement inside, slow and careful. When the door opened, it took her a second to recognize me. That pause hurt more than I expected. She looked older, smaller. Her shoulders were curved forward, like life had been slowly pressing down on her. When she said my name, her voice cracked. We stood there, not sure what to do with each other. She stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled the same, but everything felt different. The furniture had been rearranged. Some things were gone. The walls held photographs I had never been part of. She apologized for the mess. I didn't comment. We sat in the living room, the same room where she once told me to leave. She kept glancing at me like she was afraid I might disappear. I noticed her hand shaking slightly. She talked about small things at first. The weather, the neighbors, anything but the past. I listened, not because I was interested, but because I was trying to understand who she had become. At one point, she said, I didn't think you'd actually come. That sentence stayed with me. I realized then she hadn't expected forgiveness. She had expected nothing. And maybe that was her punishment. She offered me tea. Her hand shook as she poured it. She sat back down slowly, wincing as she did. That's when I saw how fragile she was. This wasn't the woman who had stood in the doorway, unmovable. This was someone worn down by time. She looked at me and said, I know I don't have the right to ask. She paused, but I didn't know who else to call. That was the truth. Not love, not regret, need. And somehow, that honesty hurt less than excuses would have. As I sat there, I understood something. Coming back didn't mean returning to what was. It meant facing what remained. And what remained was a woman who had built her life without me and was now left to face the consequences alone. I didn't know yet how this would end. But I knew one thing. The hardest part wasn't walking back into that house. It was realizing that the home I had been waiting for all those years no longer existed. We sat in silence longer than either of us expected. The kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of everything no one wants to say. She stared at her hands. I watched her breathe. Finally, she spoke. I never thought it would turn out like this. I didn't respond. Not because I was being cold, but because I wanted her to continue. She took a breath and said, "I thought you'd be fine without me." That sentence landed slowly. Not sharp, not loud, just heavy. She explained that back then she was afraid. Afraid of losing her marriage. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of choosing. So she chose the option that required the least resistance. She chose silence. She chose distance. And she convinced herself that I was strong enough to survive it. "I told myself you'd figure it out," she said. "That you didn't need me the way other kids did." I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind her that I was still a child. But I didn't, because she wasn't defending herself. She was confessing. She admitted that every time someone asked about me, it got easier to simplify the story, to leave out details, to soften the truth. Not to hurt me, but to protect herself. She said, "After a while, I believed my own version." That was the moment I understood something. She hadn't lied once. She had been lying continuously. For years. And the lie had become her shelter. She talked about the loneliness, about sitting in that house at night, listening to nothing, about realizing that the family she fought so hard to hold on to was gone anyway. "I lost everyone," she said quietly. "And I realized I lost you first." Her voice shook. She looked at me then, really looked at me. And for the first time since I was 18, she didn't look away. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I just needed you to know the truth." That was the hardest part, because the truth wasn't dramatic. It wasn't evil. It was small. Fear, avoidance, self-preservation. The kind of choices people make every day, without realizing what they cost. I felt something loosen inside me. Not forgiveness, understanding. And understanding is complicated. It doesn't erase pain. It just explains it. I told her how those years felt. Not in detail. Not with anger. Just facts. Sleeping in my car. Waiting for calls that never came. She closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her face. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct me. She let it exist. When I finished, she said something unexpected. "I didn't know how to come back from it." That sentence revealed everything. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that she didn't know how to undo the damage. So she chose not to face it. Karma didn't punish her with violence or loss. It punished her with clarity, with the understanding that avoidance doesn't erase consequences. It just delays them. And now, there was nowhere left to run. I didn't stay the night, not because I was angry, and not because I wanted to hurt her. I just wasn't ready to sleep under that roof again. Before I left, she asked quietly, "Will you come back?" I told her I didn't know. And that was the truth. Over the next few weeks, I visited her occasionally. Not every day, not on a schedule, just enough to let something new take shape. I helped with small things, grocery runs, doctor appointments, fixing what I could around the house. We didn't talk about the past much, not because it didn't matter, but because we had already said the most important things. I noticed changes in her. She didn't pretend anymore. She stopped telling stories that made her look better. When people asked about me, she said simply, "We lost a lot of time." No excuses, no explanations, just honesty. One afternoon, as I was about to leave, she said something that stayed with me. "I used to think home was something I controlled," she said. "A house, a family, a story." She paused. I know now that home is who stays, even when it's uncomfortable. I didn't respond, but I understood what she was trying to say. I never moved back in. That house wasn't my home anymore, and maybe it never would be. But I also didn't walk away again. Not completely. Forgiveness didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly, in moments, in quiet conversations, in shared silence. I didn't forgive her because she was old, or because she was sick. I forgave her because carrying the weight of that night had shaped my entire life. And I was tired. Forgiveness wasn't a gift to her. It was a release for me. She didn't get the version of me she had lost. She got someone older, more guarded, more aware of consequences. And that was part of her karma. She had to meet her child again, as a stranger. Sometimes people think karma is about balance, that if you hurt someone, you'll be hurt the same way. That's not how it worked here. Karma didn't give her pain equal to mine. It gave her understanding when it was too late to change the past. And it gave me a choice, to stay trapped in the moment I was kicked out, or to finally step beyond it. I chose to step forward, not because everything was fixed, but because I didn't want that night to define the rest of my life. Home, I learned, isn't always a place you return to. Sometimes it's something you build inside yourself, after everything else falls away. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is go back once, so you never have to keep going back again. As someone who has spent many years listening to family stories like this, I want to say something important. Not every parent who causes pain is cruel, and not every child who walks away is heartless. Most family wounds don't come from hatred. They come from fear, avoidance, and the quiet belief that time will somehow fix everything. But time doesn't heal what we refuse to face. In this story, the mother wasn't punished by loss alone. She was confronted with something far more difficult. Understanding that silence is a choice, that avoidance is a decision, and that protecting your comfort today can cost you your relationships tomorrow. That is how karma often works. Not as revenge, but as clarity. And for the child who was pushed out at 18, karma showed up differently. It arrived as a choice. The choice to keep carrying an old wound, or to finally set it down. Forgiveness in cases like this is often misunderstood. It is not approval. It is not forgetting. It is the moment you decide that your future will no longer be shaped by someone else's past mistakes. Sometimes the healthiest outcome is not reconciliation the way movies portray it. It's honest boundaries, limited closeness, and peace without pretending everything is fine. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through or are still living through, take a moment to acknowledge that. You're not weak for feeling it, and you're not alone. Stories like this exist because many people carry similar memories quietly. If you believe these kinds of stories matter, if you find value in exploring family karma and emotional truth, please take a second to like this video. It helps these stories reach others who might need them. And consider subscribing to No One Escapes Karma, so you can come back whenever you need reflection, understanding, or a reminder that actions always have consequences and healing is always possible. Thank you for listening. And remember, karma doesn't forget, but it also doesn't waste pain. It turns it into awareness when we're finally ready to see it.